So, with all that creek thought in mind, we creeped along in the darkness heading to the creek. After a few minutes, we got to the creek and stopped. Oops. Yep. The person who took point would get down and we'd each scan for threats. We stopped, waited, listened, and if everything sounded normal, we'd see if everything sounded normal. I heard the soft trickle of the creek and a little wind, but not much else. Everything sounded fine. I wasn't taking lead on this, so I looked to my partners for the mission. Well, sort of looked at them. I looked in front of me and back. I could see their outlines somewhat. This was our initial objective rally point. We'd scoot out from here, scan the creek, come back, and decide if it was good to pass. The moon was low in the horizon, and we were under moderately thick foliage. The one in the front looked back at me and pointed. I saw the movement more than I actually did anything specific. The one with the shotgun did a finger motion in the air to go loop around the street and back into the brush. I gave him the confirm, and that would be how we crossed today. It seemed to work well, so that we could cover him, and so we both weren't exposed. I more knew what he was doing for memory and putting the motions together in my head for what he meant. I did the countdown and pointed. With me and our Overwatch covering, he got up and around the creek and back in the brush. When I heard him sad, our Overwatch patted twice on his knee and off I went. I shuffled up the embankment and jogged as best as I could across the road and over the creek. No mashing through the creek today and getting wet. It was good to be mixing up the crossing. Sometimes we went above and sometimes through and sometimes around. I'd lost quite a bit of weight already over 6 weeks. I was able to jog a little bit before the collapse, but not much, and definitely not without gear on. I could jog a lot better now with everything hurting, with the gear on. It still gave me a good spin though, but there weren't any other choices. I got across the creek and back down into the bank. I stopped to listen and wait, didn't hear anything. While doing this, I also counted in my head. My tail of our 3-man squad was going to be moving in a few seconds. I moved my head around and didn't hear anything besides the creek. Our lead and I were ready to nail anything that came up as our Overwatch got across the creek. As if on cue, when I imagined the right number arriving in my head, I heard movement from behind my mini squad mate's direction. My awareness became heightened as I started to hear in even more clarity. I realized I could hear the birds far to the east of me starting to wake up. The sun was starting to wake them up before us. The temperature hadn't raised a degree yet, but it would soon. That meant we probably had another half hour or so. The local flying population didn't migrate for the winter because they were just tiny birds and could live in all of our homes. I called them mushroom birds because the clever hobby crafters used to make nearly identical copies of the critters out of mushrooms. Over the years, the way our houses were built, each house was able to host one tiny bird family. Just had to remember to never turn certain vents on. The birds kept the bugs down and made a lot of pretty songs, and they were also great foragers. It was so much fun hearing new bird babies in the spring. Also, we could feed the mommies and daddies our leftover bits of bread or chips if they went stale, so the food never went to waste. The birds also provided endless entertainment for our cats, who would watch them in awe all day long from safely indoors. I always had to remember to respectfully turn away when they flew into the house, so I didn't officially see where they were going. It was obvious where they were going, but it kept the illusion that they weren't domesticated, even though they basically were. If I ever forgot to turn around, I would get fussed at until I did. It was such great memories. Hearing the birds always meant to me that everything would be okay. Those birds had seen the sunrise, and it was going to be a new day. Soon those birds would wake up our birds, who would wake up the next birds down the line. It was the same routine every day, and it worked well. With that thought trailing off, I heard my tail counterpart go by me. His jog had turned into a walk to try to figure out where I was. It was still very dark out. I patted on my leg 2 times and waited. He patted on his leg back as he said, and that meant the maneuver was over and ready for us to move ahead. I shuffled out of my hole and got up behind him, and the 3 of us stalked on the edge of the clearing to our second temporary rally point. Then we finished our journey to the North Junction. Before long, we were getting flashed by a flashlight. That was our long-distance communication check. My partner did the correct pattern back, and we were good to go. We had got to the junction with just time to spare as the sun began to push the shadow back on our side of the gorge. Chapter 4, North Junction, Dawn, Day 1. We got close enough for a short distance communication check, and they were able to see us with the flashlights and tell who we were. Right around the same time, the East Group was coming to meet at the junction as well. We each sent people from our subdivisions to bolster the junctions for any potential dawn assault and to share information at the same time. These guys from the east were from a relatively new subdivision. It was a gated community, but without power running, they had to make some modifications. I never got to see the new system they put in place in person, but it sounded like they had machined some extra rollers somehow so they could manually move the gates. Then they had put some intersecting X-shaped beams in the way to stop vehicles from smashing through easily. It sounded like a good system. I had asked them to take a picture and bring it, so this morning one of the guys had brought a picture to show me. The constructs were very cool looking, like there had been a construction area that never got finished and the pieces got salvaged. At first glance, they looked a lot like tank traps. He explained they could also be used as partial cover and had steel wedges drilled into the concrete that they rested into. This kept the beams from easily going forwards or backwards. This was so if the beams, and he called them giant caltrops, needed to be removed for legitimate reasons, it was super easy. Otherwise, people would be able to lay fire into them to keep anyone from moving them. He explained to me that they were still on the lookout for some razor wire to help reinforce them, so people couldn't easily grab them in a hurry either. I explained to him this meant he wouldn't be able to grab them either, and he said something about how they would use ropes to pull them directly to the side. I took a while to think about the setup in my head, and it sounded good, so I nodded. Then I had another thought, and asked how the neighbors in the subdivision were taking it. He said it wasn't really a problem, they were all doctors, and they knew they had to be safe. The hospitals had all been the first thing to be raided, and the hospital was naturally close to the freeway. It had been impossible to shore up any defense in time, unfortunately. Instead, of course, trying to hold the hospital, which would have taken hundreds of people, there was a concerted effort to empty it of everything we would need. The people that were all stable enough all went home, with the doctor that was taking care of them if they didn't have family that could be reached. Some staff stayed behind that either volunteered, some were extremely dedicated or had normalcy bias and wouldn't listen. They kept thinking the National Guard or somebody would come, and nobody ever came. Or that the power would come back on to replace the generator, which had run out of fuel, but the power never came back on. Hospital supporters tried to get more fuel for the generator at one point, but all the gas stations were empty, or in one such case, sadly blown up. The gas stations were empty if they had generators, otherwise the fuel was inaccessible without an external power supply. So no power, no fuel, no generators at gas station, no fuel, so the hospital ran out of power. We eventually worked out a system to where we could snap the locks off, then manually pump the fuel, but it didn't come in time to address the hospital situation. Also, the fuel ended up being reserved for emergencies and mechanized tactical maneuvers. We had tried to explain that we didn't have people to defend a giant hospital or defend the road leading up to it. It was a giant, high-capacity, newly renovated off-ramp specifically designed for tons of traffic. We cut some trees down across the off-ramp, but the hospital is less than a quarter mile away from the freeway. That unfortunately doesn't stop or slow people down without cover fire, and is more of a courtesy than anything. We thought about ripping the signs out on the freeway, but it'd be hard to get them all. The signs varied in size for miles in each direction, and everyone even remotely knew where it was anyway. Maybe in a year the brush and trees would overgrow the area enough so it wasn't visible by the street, but for the moment it was a lost cause. I heard that some staff finally came to their senses and got out when they realized nobody was coming. The power wasn't coming back on, and there was no way to fuel the generators. Everyone terminally ill had already passed from the generators running out or from them not having enough meds on hand. When they bugged out, they took who they could to the gated community behind them, also full of doctors. It was not only gated, but had brick walls surrounding it. With some strategic sharpshooting, the bandits didn't even come close, and the staff were able to make it in with the rest of their patients okay.